Critical care is the topic right now, and I would say that it is one of the most important topics in critical care medicine, as well as a very challenging topic in infectious diseases. It can be affected, the CNS can be affected by a variety of organisms, including bacteria, viruses, mycobacteria, fungi, protozoa, and even helminths. And it's really a very high consequence situation, although it's relatively low in its incidence, and therefore it's not surprising that RCTs or randomized control trials for assessing diagnostic as well as therapeutic modalities have not been done and possibly cannot be performed, and the evidence for specific treatment approaches is relatively sparse. Also, I must tell you that the treatment is heavily dependent on local epidemiology, local practices, and so on. So, I will confine my remarks today to syndromes which include acute and chronic bacterial meningitis, viral meningitis, encephalitis, focal infections in the brain such as brain abscesses and so on, and post-traumatic, post-neurosurgical and shunt related infections which are forming an important part of the ICU mix of cases. Definitions quickly: meningitis is simply the inflammation of the meninges, and it's not surprising at all that the signs and symptoms of meningeal irritation will dominate the clinical picture and come up very early. On the other hand, encephalitis is inflammation of the brain parenchyma, and so again not surprising that neurologic dysfunction is the most early symptom in this disease. Encephalopathy is altered mental status, generally without inflammation of brain tissue, and it has different systemic causes. Unfortunately, there is a huge overlap between encephalitis, meningitis and encephalopathy, although the definitions appear to be so watertight. So, for the clinician, it becomes very difficult at times to distinguish one from the other. There are also other confounding variables. Sometimes the inflammatory response in the brain or in the meninges may be less prominent, and that may have something to do with the immunocompromised state of the host and so on. And sometimes fever could be due to systemic infection, which can also add to the diagnostic difficulty. Now, the initial empiric antimicrobial depends upon evaluation of what might be predisposing factors in that particular host, and which will obviously determine the etiology. Also, the clinician must keep in mind what out of all these are treatable causes. Similarly, source control, which is always talked about in all serious infections, it's not always possible even in cases of focal infections such as brain abscess due to the critical location of the brain lesion. Finally, antimicrobial distribution into the CNS is influenced by many factors, both physical as well as inherent physicochemical properties of the antimicrobial itself. And I might just point out that the lipophilicity, protein binding, molecular weight, ionization of that particular drug, as well as active transport outside of the CNS are all important factors. So, it's not surprising that many agents do not penetrate very well, and if at all penetration is there, it's only in the presence of very active CNS or CSF inflammation. Besides, mere CSF to serum ratio or the penetration itself is somewhat irrelevant. What is really crucial is how many times above the MIC of the organism is the level which we can achieve, and that is sometimes goes by the term called as inhibitory quotient. If that is not satisfactory, we may actually need to instill drugs into the CNS, into the CSF or into the ventricular system. Now, acute meningitis usually presents with fever, headache, meningismus, the signs of meningeal inflammation which we know all along, and altered mental status. What is important is patients develop intolerable symptoms within a short period of time, and therefore they would seek medical attention within the first few hours or at best within the first several days after the onset of illness. Various underlying conditions may also determine what might be the causative organisms. But it's very important for the clinician to remember that Streptococcus pneumoniae stands out as the most important pathogen, followed by Neisseria meningitidis, as well as in certain groups of patients it might be Listeria, it might be gram-negative bacilli, beta hemolytic strep, even Staphylococci can also produce community acquired meningitis, although overwhelmingly the first 2 or 3 are the most important ones. One may have a syndrome of subacute or chronic meningitis, a little bit less likely to actually come to the ICU directly, where the presentation can be over weeks to months. and the onset is much more gradual, and lethargy and disability are important symptoms. And these syndromes may be caused by, most importantly, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, also certain spirochetes such as Treponema pallidum, Rickettsia, fungi. So what can be the initial approach to a suspected acute community acquired bacterial meningitis? And I think this approach is something which is very important. Blood culture, and this was emphasized by our microbiologists before, that it is exceedingly important. So blood culture can perhaps be the fastest and quickest test which might actually tell us evidence of the particular bug being the causative organism. CT scanning may have to be done, especially if even before the lumbar puncture is done, especially if the patient is an immunocompromised patient or has had some CNS disease, there is a new onset seizures, papilledema or focal neurological deficits or even altered level of consciousness, and that's because we want to prevent coning during the time that the lumbar puncture is done. So the lumbar puncture might be the second step or the third step. Now if none of these indications for CT do exist, then one can straight away proceed with the lumbar puncture. However, sometimes there could be a delay in performing the lumbar puncture because there is a delay in the CT. CT was needed but could not be done in time, or it could be unavailable at the site of the treatment which is being carried out, or the patient could be seriously ill, such as maybe having shock respiratory distress, bleeding diathesis, and so on. The important thing which was already emphasized is that the CSF should be examined within 30 minutes, should not be refrigerated, and may be inoculated in a blood culture bottle for improving the yield of the organisms. Steroids and empirical antibiotics is the next step, but sometimes in patients where CT cannot be done, or for some reason LP cannot be done quickly, one is justified in doing a blood culture and then starting steroids and empirical antibiotics. Now CSF analysis in various forms of meningitis has always been taught to us right from our undergraduate days, and here it looks cut and dried properly like watertight compartments. However, anybody with experience will say that there is so much overlap between these that it is sometimes very difficult in practice to differentiate acute bacterial from a partially treated bacterial, and that would be something which is an important clinical situation. It's a common clinical situation, or viral or TB meningitis, and various parameters including the total count, the differential count, sugar, as well as the protein and CSF lactate may help us to differentiate these causes. Now, the Gram stain of the CSF is reported to be positive in 60 to 95% in Western literature. Similarly, culture of a CSF is also positive in 70 to 85% in Western literature. If you really ask me, the positivity of both these Gram stain as well as of culture is somewhat uncommon in Indian settings, and the reason could be that their prior antibiotics have been received, and most of the time when the patient comes to the ICU or to the hospital, it's like a treated or partially treated pyogenic meningitis. Most clinicians would assume that the cases are presumed to be due to strep pneumoniae. Now, latex agglutination is a test which can help to differentiate 4 or 5 of these organisms. However, its role is not agreed upon by all authorities, and IDSA guidelines do not really give a lot of importance to the use of these latex tests. Now, Binax test, which Dr. Rodrigues just told us about, is a very good test, and one can actually use it in the CSF for making a diagnosis of Streptococcus pneumoniae or pneumococcal meningitis. So, which would be the imaging modality and which would be preferred? Would it be a contrast enhanced CT scan or a MRI? This might be an important consideration for the clinician, and there are advantages and disadvantages of each of these. For example, the advantages of the CT is that it is very rapid, can detect hemorrhage, hydrocephalus very easily. On the other hand, it is less sensitive for detection of somewhat more subtle parenchymal abnormalities. On the other hand, MRI becomes the preferred modality for imaging of the parenchyma, also for detecting meningeal enhancement, and you can also do MR spectroscopy, which might throw some additional information on focal cerebral lesions. The disadvantages of the MR is that the patient needs to be very steady, which becomes somewhat difficult in a critically ill patient, a much longer time for image acquisition, and therefore the patient may have to be sedated or even anesthetized in some certain cases. There might be unavailability of this modality at the same center where the patient is being treated, and therefore the patient may need to be transported, which obviously becomes a major disadvantage. Now, antimicrobial therapy. Now, for initial antimicrobial therapy, as in all intensive care settings, antimicrobial resistance should be assumed. So, one should really hit hard, as is the common parlance in critical care medicine. The choice of the specific antimicrobial agent for either empiric or targeted therapy is finally based on local epidemiology, and therefore the clinician must know what is common in his particular area of practice. Empirical antimicrobial therapy is initiated sometimes even when the lumbar puncture is delayed, or for patients with purulent meningitis and a negative CSF Gram stain, because if it is pus in the CSF, obviously it definitely speaks of a bacterial process. Targeted antimicrobial therapy finally is based on presumptive pathogen identification by the CSF Gram stain or culture whenever it is available. One can make a fairly intelligent guess as to the nature of the bacterial pathogen from the predisposing factors. Now, it's something very important that strep pneumonia as well as meningitis form a large part of the etiology in adult patients. So, from 2 to 50 years, these seem to be the most important pathogens. People above the age of 50 may have additional microorganisms. The range of organisms increases as the person becomes more and more immunocompromised, and there are different organisms which may be related to skull base fractures, head trauma, or after neurosurgery. The antimicrobial choice obviously would be based on the basis of what pathogens are expected on the basis of the predisposing factor. So, one could have third generation cephalosporin as the most important drug to be used in the usual community acquired meningitis. Now, would we use vancomycin as is described and prescribed in the Western guidelines? Now, this comes as a somewhat difficult question. Now, vancomycin is mainly added for the premise of resistant Streptococcus pneumoniae in Western guidelines. However, the current prevalence of resistance in India appears to be low, but may be rising. The appropriate selection of antibiotic depends on the exact level of resistance of strep pneumoniae to both penicillins as well as to cephalosporins. So, one way of looking at it is to see the oxacillin zone diameters, and if you have a zone diameter greater than 20, then there is absolutely no resistance, there is no need for even testing for MICs. On the other hand, depending on the zone diameter, one considers that there might be resistance to penicillin. If the zone diameter is smaller and smaller, it means there is resistance to cephalosporins such as the third generation cephalosporins also. In these situations, the actual MIC measurement may be required. And this slide shows you how different the breakpoints are for CNS disease versus non-CNS disease. And the reason is that drugs do not penetrate the CSF very well, even in the presence of meningeal inflammation. So, the organism really needs to have an extremely low MIC for it to be susceptible for meningeal infection. Okay, so if you note here, the CNS or for the CNS infections, the resistance to strep pneumoniae is said to be present even if the MIC is more than 0.12, and it is considered susceptible only when it is less than 0.06. Now, the specific antimicrobial agents which may be used for other organisms such as Neisseria meningitidis as well as Listeria, strep and E. coli are all set out in this slide. I won't be able to read the whole thing out to you. The alternatives can also be used if susceptibility is shown. Okay, so some of the antibiotics which are set out in this particular column may not be used unless susceptibility has been actually documented. Now, additionally, we are still facing this problem, especially of post-neurosurgical meningitis, where there might be carbapenem resistant Enterobacteriaceae, Pseudomonas or Acinetobacter. And the great difficulty in these situations is to use only systemic colistin or intraventricular or intrathecal colistin for these organisms. Now, what are the recommended doses of antimicrobials for meningitis? And this, I think we should take a moment to review that, because most antibiotics are given in the highest possible doses when one is treating meningitis, because for the simple reason that the penetration into the CNS is very less, and therefore we must remember that the doses are very high. It is 12 grams of ampicillin, it is 4 grams of ceftriaxone, it is 2 grams 3 times a day of meropenem, and even the doses of liposomal amphotericin B and amphotericin B deoxycholate should be the highest possible doses. The duration of antimicrobial therapy is also decided by the particular organism which is present. So, it is as short as 7 days for Neisseria as well as Haemophilus, but might be 10 to 14 days for Strep pneumoniae, and really much longer, like 3 weeks or even longer for aerobic gram-negative bacilli as well as Listeria. This comes as an important question: what is the role of adjunctive dexamethasone in bacterial meningitis? And here we must remember that inflammation is the most important factor in meningitis, and therefore one has to control that infection, and therefore the idea that one should give steroids with or even before the antimicrobial is given. These are the doses of dexamethasone which are recommended, and guideline says that one should give it with the first dose of antimicrobial. This timing, all authorities are not unanimous in this, and this timing may have been overemphasized in some of the guidelines according to some other authorities. Now, dexamethasone should only be continued if it has been shown to be pneumococcus. Now, this also becomes a very difficult recommendation to do in practice, because most of the time we are unable to make a positive diagnosis of Strep pneumoniae meningitis. Interestingly, benefits of this adjunctive corticosteroids is seen only in high income countries, and in a study from Malawi where most patients were severely immunocompromised and HIV positive, they found in fact deleterious results of using steroids. So, overall it looks like steroids can be only one part of the whole thing. The rest of the medical management and overall process of treatment has to be perfect in order to steroids give you that additional benefit. Obviously, I need to emphasize that the benefits of steroids are not there in nosocomial meningitis, and they are only applicable to community acquired meningitis. We will shift gears a little bit and talk about encephalitis now. And we already mentioned that it is mainly the inflammation of the brain parenchyma, and therefore altered mental status comes up very soon in encephalitis. Other features such as confusion, obtundation, coma is the hallmark. Behavioral as well as speech disturbances as well as focal and diffuse neurologic signs are much more common in encephalitis and earlier as compared to meningitis. The syndrome of meningitis can sometimes coexist, and many pathogens might produce what may be called as meningoencephalitis. So, the usual diagnostic criteria which are required are major, that is altered mental status, which is required. Among the minors, fever, seizures, focal seizures, CSF pleocytosis, imaging abnormalities, EEG abnormalities are other important features of encephalitis. I need to emphasize that failure to identify a pathogen occurs in actually more than 50% cases, and therefore that does not help to exclude the diagnosis of encephalitis. Sometimes we might find a so-called pathogen outside the CNS, and whether that is really responsible to produce the encephalitic syndrome becomes a question. The diagnosis of pathogens that are common, have a specific treatment, or have a public health importance or significance is something which is very important. So, etiology of what I might call as an acute encephalitis syndrome, because the diagnosis of encephalitis is not so easy. So, I would just call it as an acute encephalitic syndrome, and here we have lots of viruses as well as certain bacteria such as Mycoplasma, Leptospirosis, Rickettsia, even typhoid and syphilis might produce a syndrome which looks like encephalitis. Interestingly, there are post-infectious causes or post-immunization causes such as acute disseminated encephalomyelitis. There are other autoimmune processes such as the aquaporin antibodies and NMDAR, vasculitic, and even paraneoplastic syndromes can also produce as encephalitis. Now, pyogenic cryptococcal meningitis, TB meningitis, brain abscesses, cerebral malaria are obviously not primary encephalitis, but in clinical practice it becomes quite difficult. Metabolic, toxic, septic encephalopathy also need to be considered. Now, there are various ways in which one can suspect particular pathogens. For example, it is based on the particular epidemiology. So, age, the immunocompromised status, the location. India is a vast country, so there might be some types of infections which are common in certain states and locations. So, occupation of the patient, the season, recent infection with some other, the infection which is going on in the community, recent vaccination or unvaccinated status, all these obviously impact what might be the causative organism for encephalitis. Now, there are certain CNS features which also point to certain organisms, like for example dementia, memory disturbances, cranial nerve involvement is much more common in certain types of organisms and less common or sometimes not even seen in other types of organisms. Rhombencephalitis is also a syndrome which may involve the lower part of the brainstem, medulla and so on, which is typically seen with listeria. Focal signs, frontal lobe signs, especially for primary amoebic meningoencephalitis, can be an important feature. The rest of the clinical examination, like presence of rash, jaundice, retinitis, parotitis, lymphadenopathy and respiratory symptoms, can also help to point to the particular etiology. Now, management of this encephalitis syndrome, as I am calling it, if no definite diagnosis is made, then very often the clinician has to use one or more of the following. So, it could be acyclovir, doxycycline, ceftriaxone and artesunate, and all these in combination perhaps might be used empirically. In the meantime, the investigations are proceeding. So, the person is going to undergo MRI, EEG, further molecular as well as serological tests both in the serum as well as in the CSF. CSF HSV PCR, if it is repeated on 2 occasions and it is found to be negative, then maybe acyclovir can be stopped. VZV is better diagnosed not by molecular tests but by the organism specific antibody index. Ceftriaxone may be stopped if pyogenic meningitis is not found. Doxy may be stopped if rickettsia and leptospirosis is excluded. However, artesunate course is completed even if malaria has not been found. And finally, it may dawn upon the physician that this might not be an infection at all and it might be another type of a problem, and that might be autoimmune or paraneoplastic. In these situations, immunomodulatory treatment may be required if an immunologic disorder is found or if an infectious cause is reasonably excluded. The next important clinical situation is TB meningitis, and it is obviously a chronic infection and may take days or weeks for non-specific symptoms to go on, such as headache, fever, vomiting and anorexia. Every effort should be made to make a microbiological diagnosis, and the search for AFB in CSF is actually crucial for the rapid diagnosis of TB meningitis. Now, there might be a few ways of improving the yield of MTB from CSF, and that is we need large volumes of CSF, perhaps we need repeated LPs. Centrifugation and pelleting of the sample can also improve the yield of detection of AFBs. Now, everyone knows that AFB culture takes too much of a time to help in the initial management of suspected TB meningitis, but may provide the critical drug susceptibility information which may be required for carrying out the future treatment of the patient. The bottom line is, if clinical features suggest that this could be TB meningitis, empiric anti-TB treatment should be strongly considered even without microbiological confirmation. Various diagnostic rules for the diagnosis of tuberculous meningitis exist, and I have found this particular rule to be very useful in my practice. It was first arrived at by Thwaites from his studies in Vietnam, and in this scoring system, the age of the patient, the peripheral WBC count, the duration of illness, CSF WBC count and the percentage of neutrophils form very, very important factors. And it's very important to note that CSF neutrophils more than 90% are in favor of pyogenic. Based on all these factors, a scoring system is given and a total score of less than 4 is suggestive of tuberculous meningitis. Now, brain imaging in a case of suspected TB meningitis is obviously very important. One can also look at for evidence of TB elsewhere, that means in the chest or abdomen or something like that, which may point to a diagnosis of TB meningitis. What about CSF ADA or adenosine deaminase? Now, that has been used widely but is fairly non-specific and it's not recommended by all authorities. Expert MTB RIF, the sensitivity in CSF varies in different centers. It may vary from 30 to 70%, and therefore not finding it positive does not rule out the diagnosis of TB. The treatment comes with the standard 4-drug ATT including isoniazid, rifampin, pyrazinamide and ethambutol. Now, some experts might recommend the use of streptomycin instead of ethambutol because ethambutol does not penetrate very well, and may consider a higher dose of rifampin or even adding fluoroquinolones. This is not yet standard practice though. The drugs should be taken each day either individually or in combination form. Patients should be treated for a minimum of 12 months, and all patients with TBM, regardless of their severity, should receive adjunctive steroids. A brief word about the penetration of drugs in TBM. So, there are certain drugs which have a very good high penetration, such as isoniazid, ethionamide, pyrazinamide and linezolid. And we must remember here, among these, isoniazid is the one which has the highest early bactericidal activity. So, combining its good penetration as well as this early EBA gives it a very prominent place in the treatment of TB meningitis. Intermediate penetration is with the quinolones as well as cycloserine. And interestingly, rifampin penetration is only about 10%. So, ethambutol, rifampin and the aminoglycosides or the injectable agents have less penetration into the CSF. Steroids, as I said earlier, is very important, and there are particular dosage regimens which have been isolated. Now, let me tell you one thing, that steroids is an extremely important part of the management of TB meningitis, both to lower the raised intracranial pressure as well as to prevent and treat vasculitis. Now, vasculitis is exceedingly damaging to the TB meningitis situation, and therefore, the use of steroids and sometimes even more advanced immunosuppression may be required. The doses, I think, are very, very important, and one should not really reduce the doses faster than what is recommended. Most of the time I have seen that one needs to go back to the previous dose very often, because the step which reduces the dose of steroids to a particular level immediately gives rise to headache and other symptoms of raised ICP. Neurosurgical referral may be needed in some cases for hydrocephalus, tuberculous cerebral abscesses, vertebral tuberculosis with paraparesis, and sometimes one may need a decompression due to developing hydrocephalus. Paradoxical response versus drug resistance in TB meningitis is an exceedingly important and a difficult problem. Now, this paradoxical response occurs because MTB itself disables the immune system. So, if one starts treating the patient, that immune system starts rebounding, which is responsible for producing vasculitic, new infarcts, new tuberculomas or even new enhancement starts coming up. It remains as a very difficult diagnosis and usually a diagnosis of exclusion. Several factors, I may point out, help in the diagnosis. So, if there has been an initial improvement followed by worsening, which is temporally associated with tapering of the steroids, it is highly indicative of a paradoxical response. Besides, adherence or non-adherence to the appropriate anti-TB treatment also helps. Very low load of MTB by the gene expert. Now, gene expert also provides this information, like it tells you whether it's a very low load or a moderate or a high load, and if while on treatment the load has reduced, it may perhaps indicate that this is not resistance and it is a paradoxical response. And finally, negative TB cultures on repeat testing may also help in sorting out this difficult problem. Now, brain abscess is another important focal abnormality in the ICU, which is very important, and it may present with headache, nausea, vomiting, seizures and so on. But remember that fever may be present in less than 50% of the patients. There are certain organisms which are angio-invasive, such as Aspergillus and Mucor, and sometimes they may present like a stroke when actually it is a brain abscess. Again, the microbiology of the brain abscess is also dependent upon what are the predisposing conditions. So, if one has otitis media or mastoiditis, then one would suspect streptococcus as well as bacteroids. If it is due to sinusitis or dental infection, or is it a penetrating brain trauma, post-neurosurgical, or is there a lung abscess and so on. So, each one of these factors, if they are present, may help us give a clue to what might be the microbial etiology of the brain abscess. Endocarditis, congenital heart disease, especially the right to left shunts, neutropenia, transplantation and HIV infection. There are certain groups of organisms which really have a tight correlation with one of these predisposing conditions, and therefore the clinician must know what he is dealing with. Now, MRI or a contrast CT is required if suspicion of a brain abscess. A lesion which is greater than 2.5 centimeters should ideally be excised, or at least a stereotactic biopsy should be done for that, and specimens should be sent for microbiology and histopathology. Now, the pace of illness in a brain abscess is certainly less than that of community acquired meningitis, and therefore one can do this procedure and then start the empirical antimicrobial therapy. So, after the patient has undergone this procedure and with the assessment of his predisposing conditions, one can make a reasonable guess as to what might be the involved organisms. MRI and contrast CT of if there is a suspicion of a brain abscess, and when there are large lesions, they should be excised or stereotactically aspirated, and the specimen should be sent for appropriate microbiology and histopathology. Empirical therapy here can possibly wait a little bit. It is not as much of an emergency as community acquired acute bacterial meningitis, where one would not even wait for that. So, here based on the patient's predisposing conditions as the presumed pathogenesis, one can make a fairly intelligent guess about what might be the involved pathogens, and treatment could be given according to that. Repeated aspirations also can be required sometimes, and if it is a non-crucial area, or if the aspiration has not really helped us in giving us the etiology, excision of an abscess may have to be carried out. The empiric therapy, as I said, depends on presumed site of origin. Usually what has been emphasized in Western literature is to use ceftriaxone and metronidazole. However, in our country, possibly we may need meropenem, vancomycin and metronidazole as empirical treatment for bacterial brain abscesses. Steroids are required if there is significant edema and mass effect. Anti-epileptic drugs will also have to be considered, especially during the early stages of therapy. Now, duration of treatment for cerebral abscess is a very uncertain area. Following an excision, it might be as short as 4 weeks. Following an aspiration, it may have to be given for 3 to 6 months. However, let me emphasize that there are no clear guidelines. The first 4 to 8 weeks of treatment may have to be given intravenously, because we really need to use large doses, at least in the beginning. And some authorities would say that you need to continue the treatment until radiologic resolution of the lesion occurs. Now, nosocomial meningitis and CSF shunt infections is also becoming an important problem in the ICU. The symptoms are quite variable. Headache, nausea, lethargy and change in mental status might happen. There might be less fever, or absence of fever does not really exclude the possibility of an infection. What is important is these organisms are different from the ones which produce community acquired meningitis. So, these organisms are less virulent as compared to the others. They evoke less amount of inflammation, and usually they are pathogenic in the presence of prosthetic material which might have been implanted at the time of neurosurgery. Sometimes there might only be minimal ventriculitis without much of meningeal involvement, or sometimes there can be a mechanical blockage of the CSF shunt as a result of biofilm formation. The diagnosis of shunt related or nosocomial meningitis is obviously by culturing relevant specimens of CSF, could be from the externalized ventricular drains, from the lumbar drains and so on. And a definite infection would be diagnosed if there is a positive CSF culture associated with a CSF pleocytosis. But let me emphasize again that CSF pleocytosis may not be so impressive as with community acquired bacterial meningitis. So, CSF as well as lactate can be normal in about 20% of the patients. As regards treatment, again this is a area where no randomized controlled trials exist. There are no prospective studies also. We need to take into account many factors, such as the need for a functioning drainage device during or after treatment may be required, and many factors need to be considered, and all of them on a case to case basis. The selection and the route of antimicrobial therapy, timing of hardware removal, timing of shunt replacement and duration of antimicrobial therapy, all of these are uncertain factors. On one hand, we need to remove the hardware which is actually draining the CSF, which is helping the patient to reduce the raised ICP, but that particular hardware may be covered with biofilm and the organisms, and unless that is removed, the infection is not finally eradicated. So, what is the appropriate time for removal of the hardware which is required both for reducing the ICP as well as for instillation of antibiotics, and what is the time when it is creating a problem and not allowing the infection to be eradicated? That becomes a very difficult problem. Empirical therapy for post-neurosurgical meningitis is intravenous vancomycin plus meropenem, but that is finally based on local antimicrobial resistance patterns, and obviously therapy will be modified once organism is isolated. Now, direct instillation of antimicrobial agents into the lateral ventricle or the lumbar thecal sac is necessary if the infection is difficult to eradicate with intravenous antimicrobial therapy. Also, I need to emphasize that many antibiotics do not penetrate CSF well, and some patients are unable to undergo the surgical components of therapy such as hardware removal. In all these situations, intraventricular or intrathecal administration of antibiotics is required. The actual dose and the volume which one is going to inject would also depend on whether or not the ventricles are dilated and whether or not the patient needs CSF drainage within a short period of time during the 24-hour period for reducing the raised ICP. The doses of various antimicrobials which have been used are set out in this particular slide, and it's important to perhaps stick to those particular doses. One important thing to remember here is the drug should not have preservatives, because some of these preservatives themselves produce chemical meningitis or seizures. Okay, so that is important. One cannot use anything outside of these recommended drugs. The duration of antimicrobial therapy for shunt related infections is also not completely defined. It depends upon so many factors, including some of the ones which I already mentioned, but typically would be at least 15 days if not 3 weeks. So, to summarize the whole talk, I would say that local epidemiology influences every aspect of management. Okay, so there is no escape from knowing what is prevalent and common in the setting that the clinician is practicing. Tracking the outbreaks as well as immunization. Now, there are immunizations available for strep pneumoniae, Haemophilus, for meningococcus, for Japanese bee encephalitis, and so on. And so all these factors must be done in the community if we want to have some benefit. The central nervous system infections are challenging, but remember that they can be rewarding if managed correctly. So what do we need for that? We need an excellent team approach, which may consist of an ID specialist, intensivist, neurophysician, neurosurgeon, along with the radiologist, microbiologist and histopathologist. Thank you.